Welcome to the Open to Hope Show. I'm your host, Dr. Gloria Horsley, with my daughter and co-host,
Dr. Heidi Horsley.
Well, Heidi, we have got someone on who I know is a topic that you are very close to your heart, and that's someone who's lost a sibling, right?
Yes, Mom. We're going to be talking today with Kathy Sparnins, and she is also going to be on our cable television show. So that will be exciting, and that's coming up very soon, next week. And Kathy has also, as you know, Mom, she is the executive producer to a fabulous movie that won a lot of awards.
Yeah, and great movie, and some of the experts in the field talking. It's a wonderful movie, giving advice. And
yes, the movie is called Voices of Grief, The Courage to Grieve in a Death-Avoiding Culture. Kathy is also a bereaved sibling, and she has lost both her parents, so she is no stranger to grief and loss. She is also a grief educator and a spiritual director. So welcome to our show, Kathy.
Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate being here.
So great to have you on. And how did you decide to make a film? Tell me about that.
Well, you know, it's one of those things that you never know when the exact chemistry happens, you know, what leads you to your work in life. But I think the most amazing thing that happened to me is being a grief educator in hospice, and it's just very fulfilling work, in my opinion. I feel like I'm present to people's love stories, and that's exactly what I've been doing for about the last 15 years. And part of what I noticed every time I did a group is that we'd be in the middle of someone sharing the sweetest of stories about their loved one, and then to a person, they would have their tears, and then they would apologize for crying. And I just was struck by that. I was struck by what has happened in our culture around what we do and we don't know how to support people in pain, and especially grief. And, you know, I think part of what happens is that it's a little scary for us. I mean, our culture has evolved very beautifully to give us this great world we live in, but I think we've gone so fast, we've gotten away from having families in the same town, and we don't have our support systems available as we used to back in the day. We used to put a wreath on the door if someone died. We saw death. And, you know, now we have antibiotics and people live a long time. And so people might see death, but they don't when they have the death that brings them to their knees.
Mm-hmm.
That's when we really do, you know, we're down on our knees, and that's sometimes when we begin to pray a little bit because we don't know what to do. And a lot of times our loved ones who are around us don't know what to do with us.
Just for some context here, did you get into the hospice world after your parents and your sister died?
Yes, I did.
What was the time frame for your parents and your sister? I know you said that your dad was relatively young when he died.
The time frame was longer than you would imagine. That's part of why I say you never know where all of these sparks come up and then what eventually happens. And I think it's very typical of someone in grief. You know, grief has its own time frame. So I was 14 when my sister was born, and when she was killed in a car accident, I was 28.
Oh, wow.
That's been some years.
And how old was your sister at the time when she died?
She was just getting ready to turn 16.
Wow.
Yeah,
so that was your first major loss, is the death of your sister.
First major loss. And it was a traumatic loss. You know, as you well know in all of your work, we have, you know, the more traumatic a loss is, the more layers we have that
Right.
just get kind of piled on. I mean, every grief is an important grief, and every grief feels traumatic to us. But, you know, the different layers of what is happening at the time of the death, I think actually
and especially to lose a sister that was so young. And after that, who was the next person in your life to die? Was it your mother or your father?
Um, After that, it was my father. And, you know, he was traumatic as well because he was this kind of bigger than life guy. He was a dentist and oral surgeon, very charismatic, but really had issues with drugs and alcohol. And so he went out one night and had a lot to drink on top of heaven knows how many. He was taking heart meds and things like that. So he died that night of upper respiratory failure. So he was only like 58.
You call grief your sacred journey. I wanted to ask you why
Why?
and what's your thought?
I think when we have, as I mentioned before, the death or the death that kind of brings us to our knees, part of what happens in that space is I think it becomes very spiritual, and I mean that is it's very individual, whatever people's spiritual path is. I always say in hospice, this is the time you go to your holy books. What do your sacred texts give you on this major life and death process? Because people are very stunned, and I speak from my own experience. I mean, we become stunned. We're not prepared for these deaths, and especially the way our culture has speeded up and really values, you know, youth and happiness and everything is going to be okay. People, I find many people struggle when they come into trying to support someone who's just had a significant death. And so, yeah.
Did you decide to make the film after working in like having your own experience with your parents and your sister dying, and then working in hospice and seeing the way that society handled it?
Right, exactly. You know, so it was an evolving process, and I do think what happens in grief is if we have the courage to open our hearts to what is happening and feel what we feel, there is the chance then that we move and we change in the midst of all that. And I call it a sacred space because it's like all the great teachers talk about, you know, you have to go through the burning to get to the light. And grief will sear your soul. And so part of it is we need people to companion with us as we walk in the midst of that, of everything we go through. And then slowly but surely, and again, it's everyone's different time frame. Part of what happens is I think we're able to reconcile the grief, we become different. I think we actually, our identity changes, our value system oftentimes changes. We become different and new.
Congratulations on completing this film, and
Thank you.
wonderful effort, and for all the work that you're doing to help those that are grieving. And Heidi, and I want to thank all of you for watching and listening to this show, and we want to remind you that if you've lost hope, please lean on ours until you find your own, and God bless.